Night missions over the Atlantic were not dangerous. They were supposed to be impossible for years. Every navy in the world believed the same thing. Darkness protected submarines. If you surfaced at night, aircraft could not see you, could not hit you, could not stop you. Radar could find you, but it could not kill you. By the time a pilot saw the target, the submarine was already gone. That belief was not theory. It was proven, repeated, and deadly. And it was wrong. The Allies were not losing the Battle of the Atlantic because they lacked technology. They were losing because they accepted a rule that everyone agreed was unbreakable. That night, attacks could never work, that darkness always favored the submarine, that the final seconds would always belong to the enemy. That assumption killed ships. It killed supply lines. It nearly starved Britain into surrender. By 1942, commanders no longer searched for solutions. They searched for explanations. Losses were measured, accepted, and normalized. Night had become a wall no one even tried to climb. Then under Moonlight, something quietly collapsed. Not a new aircraft, not a breakthrough radar, not a strategy approved by command. What failed was the belief itself. One night, darkness stopped being protection. The condition that made the mission impossible became the reason it succeeded. In a stretch of moonlit ocean, submarines surfaced exactly as Doctrine told them to, and confident, exposed, and unprepared. By the time commanders realized what had changed, 4 submarines were already gone, not across weeks, not through luck. It is not a story about genius engineering. It is the story of how a belief everyone trusted turned out to be the enemy, and how the night that was supposed to make survival certain became the moment it ended. If you think night always protects the hunter, stay with this story, because that belief is about to collapse. By 1942, the war at sea had settled into a brutal routine. Convoys crossed the Atlantic loaded with food, fuel, and raw materials that Britain could not survive without. Somewhere along those routes, German submarines waited, not hidden beneath the waves, but riding on the surface, engines running, battery charging, crews moving freely in the open air. They did this openly because they trusted the night. That trust was not arrogance. It was doctrine. German U-boat commanders understood something their enemies struggled to accept. Submerged, they were slow, blind, and nearly deaf. Their batteries drained quickly, maneuvering was limited, but on the surface, especially at night, everything changed. Speed doubled, visibility appearing. The ocean became a highway instead of a prison. Darkness turned vulnerability into dominance. The Allies were not ignorant of this tactic. They knew submarines surfaced at night. They knew where it happened. Radar made sure of that. By 1941, British patrol aircraft could detect a surface submarine from miles away. Operators watched blips move steadily across their screens, tracking targets with precision that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. But detection was not destruction. Every night, attack followed the same pattern. A radar contact appeared. The aircraft adjusted course and descended. Ends throttled back. Crews prepared their weapons. Then came the fighter. As the aircraft closed the distance, the submarine crew heard it. Even the quietest bomber could not outrun sound over open water. Alarms sounded, hatches slammed shut. Within seconds, the submarine slipped beneath the surface. By the time the pilots saw anything at all, there was nothing left to hit. This was the core problem. Not pilot skill, not courage. The problem lived in the final moments, the gap between detection and visual contact. At night, that gap could not be closed. Everyone agreed on this, tacticians. It was not debated. It was accepted as fact. So the Allies adapted, but only within the boundaries of that belief. They dropped flares hoping to illuminate the target. The flares took too long to ignite and burned too long once they did. A submarine that saw a flare had time to dive worse. Flares announced the attack before it arrived. Darkness might be broken, but surprise was lost. They tried flying faster approaches. That only made the aircraft louder. They experimented with different attack angles, different altitudes, different crew drills. None of it mattered. Physics did not negotiate. At night, the submarine always had time. Reports came back, filled with cautious language. Possible damage. Oil slick observed. Enemy contact lost. On paper, it looked like effort. In the Bay of Biscay, one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of ocean in the war, RAF Coastal Command sank exactly one submarine in all of 1941. In the same period, German U-boats were sinking merchant ships by the hundreds of thousands of tons each month. The math was unforgiving. Britain was bleeding faster than it could replace the loss, and yet no one believed the night could be beaten. This belief shaped every decision that followed. Commanders stopped asking how to win night battles and focused instead on limiting damage. Convoy routes were adjusted, shipbuilding accelerated, losses were absorbed. Darkness was treated like weather, dangerous, unavoidable, and beyond human control. This mindset had consequences. When a problem is labeled impossible, effort shifts from solving it to managing its effects. Innovation slows, risk is avoided, doctrine hardens. The war at sea entered a stalemate where one side accepted losses as the cost of survival, while the other exploited a rule everyone believed could not be broken. German commanders sensed this confidence. They wrote about it in their logs. Night surface operations were considered routine, crews relaxed, deck guns were manned casually. Lookouts scanned the horizon, not the sky. Aircraft were a threat by day. At night, they were an inconvenience at best. The Atlantic became a predictable system built on a shared assumption, and that was the real danger because wars are not decided by technology alone. They are decided by what both sides believe cannot happen. As long as darkness was assumed to be absolute protection, submarines would continue to surface, continue to hunt, and continue to escape. The Allies were not missing a weapon. They were trapped inside a belief, and beliefs once embedded into doctrine are far harder to sink than any submarine. The success of the German submarine campaign did not come from superior firepower. It came from a simple, disciplined belief. Night belonged to them. This belief shaped everything U-boat commanders did. It determined when they surfaced, how they hunted, and how they survived. Submarines were never meant to fight underwater. Beneath the surface, they were slow and blind, creeping forward at a crawl while batteries drained with every minute. Underwater was where submarines hid, not where they won. Victory happened on the surface. At night, a surface submarine was faster than any convoy it hunted. 17 knots against ships that struggled to make 10. From that speed came choice. U-boat commanders could scout ahead, position themselves, and attack at dawn from the perfect angle. Darkness was not a shield. It was an accelerator. Allied aircraft understood this in theory, but doctrine turned theory into paralysis. Radar gave patrol plans. A radar contact told crews where a submarine was, but not how to kill it. Night attacks depended on a fragile sequence of events that always broke at the same point. Sound traveled faster than aircraft. Darkness hid the final approach, dove first, and escape first. This was not a flaw in training. It was a limitation everyone accepted. German commanders built routine around that certainty. Night surfacing became so common that it felt safe. Crews recharged batteries without urgency. Deck crews moved freely. Lookouts scanned for silhouettes on the horizon, not shadows above. Aircraft were expected during daylight. At night, they were background noise. This confidence had strategic consequences. U-boats began to operate aggressively in areas that would have been suicidal during the day. The Bay of Biscay became a transit highway instead of a danger zone. Submarines crossed it on the surface night after night, trusting doctrine more than luck. Reports from Coastal Command pilots painted a consistent picture. Approaches were textbook perfect. Crews followed procedures precisely, and still, nothing was destroyed. After-action reports grew increasingly cautious, filled with ambiguous, oil, slick, observed. As losses mounted, Allied leadership faced a choice. Challenge the doctrine of night dominance, or adapt to living with it. They chose adaptation. Convoys were rerouted. Scores were enforced. Shipyards worked around the clock. The strategy became survival through endurance, not disruption. This response made sense on paper. By accepting night as untouchable, the Allies locked themselves into a defensive posture. Imagination slowed, risk-taking disappeared. New ideas were filtered through layers of regulation designed to prevent failure, not enable victory when darkness is declared unbeatable. The only remaining option is to abandon. Their confidence grew not because they believed they were invincible, but because their enemies behaved as if they were. Night operations expanded. Surface time increased. The doctrine reinforced itself with every successful patrol. Belief hardened into habit, and habits are dangerous. When both sides accept the same assumption, it becomes invisible. No one questions it. No one tests its limits. It stops being an idea and becomes reality. The doctrine of darkness did exactly that for the Allies. Night became something to endure. For the Germans, it became something to exploit. And as long as that balance held, the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic was mathematically inevitable. Every surface submarine at night represented a problem the Allies could see but not solve. Every successful dive reinforced the idea that solving it was pointless. Over time, even asking the question, it did not just protect submarines, it shaped how everyone thought about the war. But doctrines collapse the same way they are built. Through experience that contradicts belief. They do not fail gradually, they fail suddenly. All it takes is one moment that should not be possible, one night where the rules do not apply. One engagement that forces commanders to reconsider what they thought was certain, and when that happens, confidence does not disappear quietly. It shatters. The doctrine of darkness was about to meet that moment, not through a grand strategic shift, not through overwhelming force, but through a failure so specific, so undeniable, that it could not be explained away. The night was about to stop behaving the way everyone expected, and when it did, the Atlantic would never be the same. By the time Allied commanders accepted that night belonged to the submarine, they stopped asking the most dangerous question in war: what if we're wrong? On paper, the Allies had everything they needed. Radar was improving rapidly. Aircraft patrols covered thousands of miles of ocean. Crews were experienced, disciplined, and increasingly desperate to make a difference. If victory depended only on equipment, the problem should have been solved. It wasn't because technology does not win wars by itself. It only works within the limits of how people choose to use it. Radar was the perfect example. It could detect a surface submarine long before a human eye could see it. Distances were measured. Bearings were calculated. For the first time in naval warfare, submarines could be found consistently, even in total darkness. But finding was not the same as finishing. Radar could guide an aircraft close, but it could not close the flanks. Not miles, and in those seconds technology fell silent. No matter how precise the approach, the attack still depended on visual confirmation. A pilot had to see the target. A bombardier had to aim without light. None of it mattered. The Allies tried to brute force the problem. They dropped flares hoping to turn night into day. The flares burned too slowly, drifted unpredictably, and warned the enemy long before they illuminated the target. Submarines simply dove earlier. Darkness returned. Nothing changed. They experimented with brighter landing lights. The lights drained power, reduced performance, and still failed to illuminate the ocean far enough ahead. They trained crews to attack faster. That failed too. Speed could not outrun sound. An aircraft heard was an aircraft defeated. Every solution collapsed at the same point. The moment light appeared, surprise vanished. And without surprise, night attacks were pointless. This failure created a deeper problem. Command structures began to treat night attack as a closed case. The conclusion was already written. It could not work. Any proposal that challenged this assumption was filtered through layers of regulation designed to prevent risk, not encourage it. New ideas were dismissed but because they threatened stability. Wartime organizations value predictability. They fear deviation. In that environment, the word impossible becomes a shield. If something is impossible, you don't need to explore it. If it's impossible, failure is acceptable. If it's impossible, respite. Pilots learn not to expect success at night. Reports became exercises in documentation rather than discovery. Everyone did their job, and everyone accepted the outcome. Losses continued. Merchant ships vanished into the Atlantic. Crews drowned in darkness. Supplies failed to arrive. Yet the night problem remained frozen in place. Visible, acknowledged, and untouched. The doctrine of darkness had evolved into something stronger than a tactical belief. It had become institutional truth. To challenge it meant challenging engineers, commanders, procedures, and reputations built over years of service, and war does not reward those who challenge institutions politely. They possessed the tools to detect the enemy, but lacked the willingness to question why detection never led to destruction. The problem was framed as technical, when in reality it was conceptual. The real limitation was not power, it was timing, and no one was willing to reframe the problem that way. The assumption was simple: illumination must come first. Light must precede attack. That assumption shaped every failed solution. Flares, lamps, and illumination techniques were all designed to reveal the target before the aircraft arrived, which meant the enemy always had time. No one considered reversing the sequence. No one asked what would happen if light arrived after surprise was complete, if darkness itself was used as a weapon rather than an obstacle. Those questions did not fit inside existing doctrine, so they were never asked. The Germans sensed this stagnation. Submarine commanders wrote with growing confidence about night operations. Surface time increased. Night patrols were annoying but rarely dangerous. The Atlantic settled into a pattern both sides understood, and that is when wars become vulnerable, because patterns invite disruption. Doctrines involved on shared assumptions collapse when someone refuses to accept them. The Allies did not need a revolutionary machine, one that broke the sequence everyone took for granted, one that treated the final seconds not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. That question was coming, not from a committee, not from a research lab, not from a strategic doctrine paper. It would come from someone willing to look at the problem and say what no one else would. What if the night itself was the mistake? The turning point did not arrive as a breakthrough announcement or a new directive. There was no memo declaring the end of night dominance, no press release, no doctrine rewritten overnight. It began quietly with frustration. By early 1942, coastal command crews had flown hundreds of night patrols with nothing to show for them. Radar contacts came and went. Perfect approaches ended in empty water. The pattern was so consistent it stopped being questioned. Night attacks failed because they always had, except one thing no longer made sense. If radar could place an aircraft within seconds of a surface submarine, and if the submarine still escaped every time, then the problem was no longer distance, it was sequence. The order in which events happened mattered more than their intensity. Darkness was not defeating the attack, warning was. From watching the same failure unfold again and again, until the failure itself became data, somewhere in those final seconds, between sound and sight, was the entire war at sea. The assumption everyone lived by was simple. Illumination had to come first. Light revealed the target, then the aircraft attacked. Every illumination method announced intent. Flares burned too long, lamps turned aircraft into beacons. The moment light appeared, the submarine knew exactly what was happening. The dive began immediately. Darkness returned. The attack failed. What no one had questioned was duration. How long did the emits? It was not even tens of seconds. It was moments. Submarine crews did not need to fight back. They did not need to aim. They only needed time to disappear. Take that time away, and everything changed. This was the crack in the doctrine. The idea was almost offensive in its simplicity. What if light did not precede the attack? What if it arrived at the very last instant, not to search, but to finish? What if illumination was not a signal, but a trap? For months, this line of thinking had been dismissed without discussion. It violated engineering assumptions. It violated common sense. Power required generators. Generators added weight. Weight fueled range and performance. The math was clear, except the math had never included timing. The breakthrough was not generosical. It was conceptual. Instead of asking how to light the ocean, the question became how briefly it needed to be lit, not continuously. 3 seconds of visibility at attack distance would do more than 30 seconds of warning ever could. In those seconds, a submarine could not dive, deck crews could not react, Guns could not be manned. The enemy would be frozen, not by fear but by physics. The doctrine of darkness depended on reaction time. Remove it, and night lost its advantage. This idea did not arrive fully formed. It emerged in fragments, lit sketches, calculations, rough tests conducted after hours. It lived in notebooks and workshops, not command briefings. It was explored quietly because saying it out loud sounded absurd. Illuminating a submarine at 50 feet in total darkness, without warning, undoing it safely. They violated everything the experts believed, which is why it mattered. The early attempts were crude, too weak, too heavy, too dangerous. Each failure reinforced the official conclusion: impossible. But unlike previous solutions, these failures pointed somewhere. They failed not because the concept was wrong, but because it was incomplete. The key was separation. Power did not need to come from the aircraft systems. Duration did not need to be long. Safety did not need to be perfect. Weight only sufficient. For the first time, the problem was being solved backward. Starting from the moment of attack instead of the moment of detection, this approach terrified commanders. It introduced risk-at-eye modifications, non-standard equipment, battery packs that bypass safety systems, devices that did not appear in manuals. In a bureaucracy built to control failure, this was heresy. Warnings followed, orders were issued, threats were implied, and yet the work continued. Because by this point, the cost of doing nothing was higher than the cost of being wrong. The war at sea was approaching a breaking point. Convoy losses were no longer abstract. They were visible in empty warehouses and rationed meals. Britain surviving it slightly. The first operational test was never meant to be historic. It was meant to be final. Either the idea worked, or it died quietly, dismantled and forgotten. The aircraft lifted into the night carrying more doubt than expectation. The crew understood the stakes, not just tactical failure, but careers, reputations. The radar contact appeared like it always did. The approach was textbook. Engines throttled back, descent steady, darkness absolute. The submarine was there, unseen, confident, exposed. Everything depended on timing. At attack distance, the switch was thrown. For the first time, night did not dissolve gradually. A burst of light erupted beneath the aircraft, turning black water into a frozen scene. The submarine appeared exactly where radar said it would be, caught on the surface, crew exposed, momentum gone. There was no warning, no reaction, no escape. The illumination vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. The ocean returned to darkness. But something had changed. The assumption had failed. Not in theory. In practice, the submarine did not vanish. It did not dive cleanly. It did not escape untouched. For the first time in years, a night attack had forced an outcome that could not be explained away. Reports followed, arguments erupted, engineers objected, commanders hesitated. Everything about the test was challenged, except the result. Night had been breached. The doctrine of darkness had been built on certainty, on the belief that the final seconds always belonged to the submarine. That belief was now broken, not gradually, instantly. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether night attacks could work. It was how long it would take before everyone realized they already had. Once the assumption collapsed, reality moved faster than doctrine. The first successful night engagement did not spread as a rumor, it spread as a number, a single confirmed result where there had been none before. In a war measured by tonnage and attrition, one data point was enough to demand attention. Not because it was decisive, but because it was impossible under the old rules. Commanders argued, engineers protested. Safety officers raised alarms. Every objection had merit. But none could erase what had already happened. A surface submarine had been caught at night and failed to escape. Crews flew with a new understanding of the night. Darkness was no longer an obstacle to endure. It was a condition to control. Radar still guided the approach, but now it guided something different. A trap rather than a chase. Aircraft descended silently, holding their position until the last possible moment. Submarines continued to surface as Doctrine instructed them to. Batteries needed charging, engine needed air. Crews trusted the same rules that had protected them for years. The moonlight reflected off the ocean exactly as it always had. That predictability was fatal. The sequence, reach intact, silent approach, final alignment. Then, at the moment where failure had once been guaranteed, the night broke apart. A brief, violent burst of illumination locked the submarine in place. Not through fear, but through disbelief. There was no time to dive, no time to react. The ocean for 3 seconds became a stage. Depth charges followed immediately. But the submarine did not. The first confirmed sinking removed any remaining doubt. It was not an anomaly. It was a pattern waiting to be exploited. Patrol reports changed tone almost overnight. Ambiguity disappeared, replaced possible damage. For the first time in years, night patrols returned with certainty instead of excuses. Then came the night that rewrote everything. Under a full moon, patrol aircraft encountered not one surface submarine but several, all operating under the same assumptions, all following the same routine. Darkness had made these routes efficient. Moonlight made navigation easier. Night was still considered safe. One by one, that belief collapsed, not scattered across weeks, not diluted by chance. 4 separate contacts, 4 separate attacks, each executed under identical conditions. The moon illuminated the ocean just enough to guide the approach. The final seconds belonged to the aircraft. The result was not chaos. It was simultaneous reports, but did not fit existing explanations. Patrol schedules broke down. Expected arrivals never came. The night, once predictable, had become hostile. This was not simply a tactical loss. It was psychological. Submarine warfare depended on confidence. Crews accepted extreme risk because surface at night, recharge, move fast, escape at the first sign of danger. That promise had just been broken. Lent publicly, repeatedly, and without warning. For the first time, submariners feared the sky after sunset. The effects spread quickly. Commanders altered routine. Surface time shortened. Battery management grew desperate. Crews chose suffocation over exposure. Daylight operations increased, despite the danger from at forts and fight to danger. There was no longer a safe phase of the patrol. The ocean had become continuous combat. Allied command could not ignore the shift. The numbers forced their hand. In the months before these night engagements, submarine losses in key patrol zones were minimal. Afterward, they surged. Success rates did not improve. Gradually, they jumped. The problem that had resisted years of effort had not required a massive technological leap. It had required a change in belief. This realization triggered an institutional reversal. What had been dismissed as impossible was now treated as urgent. Motivation spread rapidly. Crews learned timing. Instead of procedure, precision replaced caution. The enemy adapted too, but too late. German command issued orders limiting night surface operations. Battery recharging was pushed into daylight. Routes were altered. Patrol areas shrank. These changes saved some boats. Submarines that hid by day and crept by night lost the speed and flexibility that had made them effective. The balance of the Atlantic shifted. What had once been a war of attrition turned into a contest of exposure. Every surface submarine now risked annihilation. Every patrol carried uncertainty. The doctrine of darkness had not merely failed, it had reversed. Night no longer protected, it betrayed. The moon, once an ally, became a liability. Within months, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Convoy losses slowed, patrol reports stabilized. Britain's supply lines began to recover, not because the enemy had vanished, but because its freedom of action had been strangled. 4 submarines under Moonlight did not win the war at sea, but they ended it as the enemy understood it. They marked the moment when a belief collapsed faster than steel. When years of certainty gave way to a single realization. The night could no longer be trusted. And in war, when trust disappears, defeat follows. The Atlantic did not grow quieter after that night. It grew deadlier, continuous, unforgiving. The era of safe darkness was over, and with it vanished the advantage that had nearly decided the war. The immediate effect of those moonlit losses was confusion. The lasting effect was paralysis. Submarine warfare had always depended on rhythm. Surface at night, move fast, recharge, hide by day. That rhythm allowed commanders to plan patrols, manage batteries, and coordinate wolf-pack attacks across vast distances. German commanders issued new orders almost immediately. Surface time was restricted, night transits were shortened, crews were instructed to dive at the first hint of aircraft noise. Even if batteries were low and air was stale, survival replaced efficiency. That choice carried a cost: submarines that remained. Attacks became cautious. Wolfpacks dissolved into isolated boats struggling to complete missions that once felt routine. The ocean did not change, but how it was used did. For the Allies, the shift was just as dramatic. Night patrols, once flown with resignation, were now flown with intent. Crews no longer expected failure. Radar contacts were treated as leads, not dead ends. Training emphasized patience and timing over speed. The night became something to shape rather than endure. This change spread faster than any formal doctrine. Pilots shared experiences informally. Crews learned from each other. Successful tactics propagated through squadrons. Once, crews saw that night kills were possible. Belief followed action. Statistics reflected the transformation. Areas that had once been transit highways for submarines became danger zones. Loss rates increased sharply in regions where night patrols were concentrated. The Atlantic began to narrow. Convoys no longer felt hunted continuously. A score could plan with confidence. Air cover became a constant threat rather than a daytime inconvenience. The sense of inevitability that had haunted Allied shipping began to fade. This was not because submarines disappeared, it was because their freedom of movement vanished. Strategically, this mattered more than any single engagement. Wars at sea are won by denying the enemy options. Once submarines could no longer rely on darkness, every decision carried risk: surface or suffocate, run fast or hide blind, attack or survive. None of the choices were clean anymore. German command recognized the danger. New technologies were proposed. Countermeasure under pressure moves slowly, especially when the underlying advantage has evaporated. You cannot replace a broken assumption overnight. Meanwhile, Allied confidence grew. Supply lines stabilized. The calculus of starvation changed. Britain's survival no longer hinged on endurance alone. The psychological shift was just as important as the material one. Submarine crews who once trusted night now feared it. Lookouts scanned the sky instead of the horizon. Every engine sound carried uncertainty. The moment of safety, the surfacing after sunset, became the moment of greatest risk. Fear crept into routine that had once felt automatic. That fear spread faster than any weapon. Reports from captured sailors revealed a pattern. Crews spoke less about Allied aircraft in general and more about sudden light, about moments when darkness shattered without warning, about attacks that came not with pursuit but with finality. 3 seconds, no escape. For the Allies, this did not create peace. It created pressure. Continuous patrols demanded resources. Crews were exhausted. Aircraft were stretched thin. But the difference was purpose. Every flight now had a chance to matter. Attrition worked both ways. As 1943 approached, the Battle of the Atlantic entered a new fight strained. Experienced crews vanished faster than they could be replaced. The strategic initiative shifted decisively. The war at sea did not end with a dramatic announcement. It ended gradually as the enemy's options narrowed until defeat became structural rather than situational. Darkness had once been a constant. Now it was a variable. That change rippled outward. Invasion timetables stabilized. The flow of men and material across the Atlantic accelerated. Operations that would have been impossible under constant submarine threat became feasible. The night that had once nearly starved Britain now enabled its counter-offensive in Ramallah was not the scale of the technology involved. It was the scale of the belief that fell. For years, both sides had organized their behavior around a shared certainty. When that certainty died, the war did not merely tilt, it restructured. This is how wars are truly decided, not by overwhelming force alone, but by moments that invalidate entire ways of thinking. The Allies did not win because they saw better. They won because they saw differently. The doctrine of darkness had promised safety through concealment. Its collapse exposed a deeper truth. No advantage is permanent. No assumption survives contact with reality forever. And once the night turned against those who trusted it, there was nowhere left to hide. History often remembers wars through weapons, guns, aircraft, ships, but the Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by a machine. It was decided by the collapse of a belief. For years, darkness had been treated as a law of nature, something beyond strategy, beyond challenge. Both sides accepted it, and as long as that belief held, the outcome of the war at sea seemed inevitable. When the night stopped behaving as expected, everything changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. Submarines did not vanish overnight. Crews did not surrender of defeat. Instead, something more damaging occurred. Confidence eroded. Routine broke down. Decisions became heavier, slower, more cautious. Every patrol carried uncertainty where certainty had once existed. Darkness had lost its meaning. For the Allies, this shift unlocked more than victories. It restored initiative. Convoys moved with greater assurance. What had once been a war of survival became a war of preparation for the enemy. The change was existential. Submarine warfare relied on predictability. Once that predictability died, the strategy could not be repaired fast enough. New equipment came too late. New tactics arrived too slowly. The night no longer belonged to anyone. That is the uncomfortable truth of this story. There was no magic moment where darkness was defeated. It was repurposed, exploited, turned against those who trusted it too completely. What failed was not technology, but certainty. And certainty is always the most fragile thing in war. After the Atlantic shifted, the conflict accelerated toward its conclusion. Supplies flowed, armies moved, invasions became possible. The war did not end because submarines were destroyed. It ended because they could no longer shape events the way they once had. Yet there is a quieter ending hidden beneath the statistics. The men who flew those night patrols did not think they were rewriting doctrine. They were solving a problem in front of them. They were not chasing glory or recognition. They were chasing an answer to something everyone else had stopped questioning. Most of them were forgotten, their missions recorded in logs, their innovations absorbed into procedure, their victories reduced to numbers. But the night remembers. It remembers the moment it stopped being safe, the moment belief cracked, the moment an impossible mission forced a war to change direction. This story is not about brilliance. It is about courage of a different kind. What everyone else accepts. The courage to look at a rule that has never failed and ask whether it deserves to exist at all, because in war as in life, the most dangerous beliefs are not the ones that are wrong. They are the ones no one thinks to question. And sometimes the most important victories do not come from overpowering the enemy, but from proving that the night they trusted will never protect them again. If you want more true stories where a single broken belief changes the course of war, subscribe to the channel. These are not the stories they teach you, but they are the ones that decide history.